Welcome to another edition of HOA Today. I'm Mark Foster on the HOA Leadership Network. Well, if you live in an HOA, undoubtedly you've probably heard of, or maybe if you're on the board, conducted a reserve study. But despite all of that, there seems to be a lot of miscommunication, maybe some misunderstanding about reserve studies and what they can do for HOA property values. Here to unpack it all is Antony Startup. He is the president of Criterium Twin Cities Engineers. They're located in Edina. Antony, thanks for joining today.
No problem. Happy to be here. Thanks, Mark.
So, Antony, tell me a little bit about Criterium Twin Cities Engineers. How do you describe your services?
Yeah, so we're an engineering consulting company, like you said, based in Edina, and we specialize exclusively on residential and commercial real estate. So we deal a lot with HOAs. HOAs are probably around about 20% of our work. Nationally, we've got around about 30 offices and access to a pretty significant network of professional engineers, around 75 across the US. So we're spending a lot of time in and out of buildings. Buildings and building technology is really all that we do every day. So that's our specialty and that's our niche.
You've been a speaker at our chapter meetings at the HOA Leadership Network, and it seems like people have lots of questions. So let's start fundamentally. What is a reserve study and how is it beneficial to an HOA property?
Yeah, so a reserve study is really intended to be a financial planning tool. So it's an assessment of the assets the community board is responsible for maintaining, repairing, and replacing. And so I think of a reserve study, it falls into kind of that business piece of a board member's responsibilities. So if you look at the HOA board members as board members of a business, the reserve study is intended to be that strategic plan that helps you to manage those assets, understand their condition, and plan for those bills that you know are coming at some point. We don't always know when they're due and when they're going to be there, but we know that they're coming at some point. So it's supposed to be that roadmap over, a study period of about 30 years that helps you plan for those costs.
Well, certainly every HOA is going to be different in terms of a reserve study. I would think with different components, different amenities, different sizes, different types. So, Antony, walk us through the common key components that are part of a comprehensive reserve study.
So in terms of the comprehensive components of a reserve study, the first part is really to your point about understanding what are the common and limited common components. So that's really what we need on the front end to understand how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take us to put together a reserve study. And then we start with the data gathering, talking to the board about really what it is that they want to get out of a reserve study, maybe what issues they're having at their communities. And that all then feeds into that reserve study in terms of the funding plans that we produce, the evaluation that we do on site, really understanding the condition of the assets and the future, like I said, maintenance repair costs of those assets as we're looking at that study period.
It seems like there'd be a lot to consider given the variability of HOAs in Minnesota and really understanding how you can tackle even the study itself.
Yeah, there certainly is. I mean, so the common components can vary. That's definitely one of the biggest areas that you see in terms of variety between HOAs. What you can never assume that something's going to be a common component. Roofing, siding, they tend to be common components, but there's also a lot of elements that have some variability between communities, certainly.
So let's describe the process. Let's say an HOA hires you, and given everything you've said, it's going to be variable. But certainly you have to start somewhere and you have to end somewhere. So can you describe for viewers how the process works? How do you go about this?
Yeah. So the first phase is really that data gathering phase. So we're looking at talking to board members and asking them questions about what is your list of common and limited components? What are your community members complaining about? What are the kind of hot button topics in terms of the community assets that people are talking about, that have concerns around? And we also would want to know if you've had any previous engineering studies done, not just reserve studies, but forensic engineering studies. If you've had historic issues, for example, with water intrusion, you've had some water studies, all of that data gathering really helps us to prepare for what the next step is, which is the on-site visit. So you've got a data gathering phase before we get to site. Then we will come to site and do an assessment, a walk around the community, looking at really the condition of the assets and trying to determine what we think is the remaining useful life. And then we feed all of that information, so the data gathering information, the data that we gather from the on-site visit, we put all of that into the reserve study and the reserve study funding plans that we then produce for the board members to make a decision on. This is what we see in terms of funding expectations over the next 30 years. And we do our best to build that roadmap of upcoming expenses and projects, and then give them some options on how we think they should fund that number for the next 30 years.
Yeah, so speaking of funding, I am on the board of my HOA, so I've been involved in two reserve studies that have been conducted on our HOA property, and it can be a bit daunting when you see the numbers. Certainly there is a lifespan to amenities, there's a lifespan to buildings and other construction that's on the property. And it's your job really to look at that lifespan and determine what a replacement value is. So how do you forecast that? What are the general parameters that you use to ensure that you're giving an HOA property a decent range of what it's going to cost?
Yeah, and that is for sure one of the biggest challenges when you're looking at reserve studies is trying to use your crystal ball to figure out, okay, what are the expenses going to be in 5, 10 years, 30 years time? So I think the thing that we benefit from locally is, as I mentioned at the beginning, all day, every day, we're in and out of buildings. So we're doing these assessments. We've got a lot of experience evaluating the current condition of what we expect to be the remaining useful life. And we also benefit from the fact that we do have access to those 30 other offices across the US. We all feed our reserve studies into the same system. So I get access to a wide range of opportunities to calibrate costs and see how things maybe are changing across the country and locally. So that certainly helps. We also have access to tools like RS Means, which are online calculators, which can help us to figure out what the cost of certain projects do, again, as another benchmark to make sure that we're calibrated and we're looking at the right numbers, at least in the right ballpark. And then, of course, we're involved in projects. So we are involved in helping with the bidding and analysis of these types of projects all the time as well. So that certainly helps when we get contractor involvement too, and we can verify, okay, the numbers that we're talking about for this project are at least comparable to what we're seeing from vendors in real time today.
Sure, and it certainly is a great value to an HOA that gets a reserve study when they can look at what the long-term ramifications are of replacement value. So how frequently, Antony, should a Minnesota HOA conduct a reserve study? I would say this is probably one of the most misunderstood parts from my standpoint when we do our chapter meetings. If there's a question about it's usually this: how often should an HOA do a reserve study?
Yeah, I think there's probably confusion around it because there are different types of reserve studies. And so those different types of reserve studies can then lead to different frequencies. When we're talking about really a full comprehensive study, like the person coming out on site doing the evaluation, the typical recommendation is every 3 years. So that would be a good benchmark to have in your mind. The only variable I would say that comes into play would be just uncertain conditions. So tariffs would be an uncertain economic condition that you'd have to kind of factor in. If you've had one done, say, a year ago, you might consider at least having a review and a touch point on to figure out if that really needs an update because of the changing price of materials and labor. As a general rule, say every 3 years, I think board members and boards should be reviewing their reserve study every year and really doing a look back to say, okay, so previously our study said we were going to do these projects and it was going to cost this much last year. Where did we actually land? Did we do those projects? Where did we land on costs? So that annual review, I think, will help people to then calibrate, okay, what are we missing here? If it's off base, talking to a consultant about potentially why that is and what they need to do. So that could trigger an earlier than 3 years reserve study.
We're talking with Antony, startup of Criterium Twin Cities Engineers, and we'll take a quick break. We're going to discuss common misconceptions of reserve studies when we continue. If you're an HOA board member with a desire to stay on top of HOA issues, now's your chance to join the fastest growing education association in Minnesota, the HOA Leadership Network.
Our mission is to support HOA leaders through education, collaboration, and research. There are 4 chapter locations in the metro area. Membership is free, and meetings are monthly. For the schedule near you and to join, visit HOALeadershipNetwork.com.
Welcome back to HOA Today. I'm Mark Foster. We're talking with Antony, startup of Criterium, Twin Cities engineers. So, Antony, it appears there are a lot of common misconceptions regarding reserve studies. We've touched on one already about the time frames, the renewal periods, the time frames when HOA should look at reserve studies. What kind of other misconceptions do HOA board members have, from your view, about reserve studies in general?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is around getting a reserve study done maybe one time and then thinking you're done, right? You're good. So if you have that mindset of, okay, I've done my study and now I'm good for the next 30 years because I know what my forecasts, what my projects are going to be and how much they're going to cost, that's a misconception. I mean, obviously, we're going to need to update those and look at those reserve studies on a frequent basis. So that's the biggest one. And then the other one, I think, is understanding the variability around costs. So that tends to be the biggest area when people call us and they've got questions about past reserve studies. It tends to be around the estimates either being too high or too low on the project costs, and people are trying to understand, well, why would that be? And generally, the biggest reason is because, like we talked about earlier, we're using a variety of tools, some online tools, but most of the time, unless it's a project that's coming up very soon with a significant cost, most of the time we're not getting contractor bids. So those tend to be the 2 biggest questions because people just, again, are not necessarily understanding the process behind the scenes of what goes into a reserve study.
You know, that leads into my next question. I would say we hear a lot at the network at chapter meetings from people who are confused about reserve studies, and then maybe hear you speak or get some information from our network about reserve studies. They have a difficult time explaining to their fellow board members who may not be at those meetings how important, how critical it is to have a reserve study done. What's your advice, Antony, on how a board member who is a bit more in the know on this, how can they go back to their board and give them better information so that, basically HOAs do the right thing and get a reserve study done on a regular basis?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do think that education component is definitely missing, right? And that's one of the reasons that, I like being part of the HOA Leadership Network. I think it's a great resource for board members that want to become educated about a range of topics. I think the ability for board members to connect people who maybe have questions around the value of a reserve study is really to take it back to the intent of a reserve study. So if you think about it at a very high level, if you go back to that wearing your business hat, the strategic plan piece, what we're trying to avoid with the reserve studies is special assessments. And we're trying to make sure that property values are maintained and that your community is set for the long term financially. That's really the 3 priorities that we focus on. And I think anyone on a board can agree that those are things that they align with, right? They don't want to do special assessments. They do want their communities to be financially healthy, and they do want to maintain their own property values as well as the value of the community. So I think bringing it back to that common ground is always the easiest way to help people kind of understand the value of a reserve study. And then obviously bringing someone in, you have kind of an unbiased third party opinion that can cut through some of the back and forth that you often get on boards about value of reserve studies or what they're really trying to tell you as well.
And perhaps this video will help as well for some board members who need some information. So when it comes to, the funding of a reserve, you've got a lot of expenses over the last couple of years that really have been impacting HOA fees and funds. And, the top one's probably been insurance, as we've been talking about often, insurance premiums just going through the roof. And that has affected monthly dues. I would say reserves is right up there in terms of, contributing to the reserve accounts so that in the future, the HOA can do proper maintenance, proper replacements when things wear out. What's your advice on how an HOA can fund reserves?
Yeah, in terms of funding the reserves, it's always a challenge because of exactly what you said. There's normally a number of competing factors for people's dollars, right? So insurance is a big one. And really, in terms of reserves, what we're trying to do is plan for the future. And I think that's another reason that reserve funding can take a back seat because it's not the fire that's going to burn you tomorrow necessarily. It could be a few years down the road, but I think it's really again connecting people with we know those bills are coming. We know roughly how much they're going to cost. We know hopefully roughly what time frame with the reserve study having an honest conversation about how are we planning for it and what can we do to adequately fund for it. And if you're really in a bad spot in terms of the funding, maybe where you are now versus where you were previously when you had the reserve study, I would encourage people to go back to their reserve study consultant or reach out to a financial planners because reserve study consultants are not financial planners. Um, and try and get some additional information about what options perhaps they do have in terms of ways to fund what needs to be funded. I mean, again, that bill's coming due. It's just a case of when.
When it comes to Minnesota state law or regulations that HOA boards are, privy to, is there any of those laws or regulations that board members should be aware of when it comes to reserve studies themselves?
Yeah, so in terms of Minnesota, we do have the Common Interest Ownership Act, which applies to reserve studies built, I believe it's mid 1994, so around that time frame and afterwards. And what they really talk about is the importance of having adequate reserves. But there's a lot of obviously interpretation of what adequate can mean. And so that can cause confusion. But that is a requirement to have adequate reserves. They have some requirements around reviewing your reserves. And I believe that's every 3 years. And also, in addition to that, they have some requirements around making sure that you're funding them appropriately in terms of separate bank accounts for operating funds and reserve funds. So those are really the things that I would be thinking about. And even if that Common Interest Ownership Act does not apply to you, it's still pretty good common sense advice that even if that's not directly applicable, you should be considering as part of that reserve study process as well.
Take off your sales hat for a moment. You've obviously you have some
Yeah.
competition, but really, what should HOA boards look for when it comes to a professional so that they're picking the right expert, for their needs?
I think it's a great question. So, in terms of really picking the right consultant, it would go back to that data gathering stage we talked about, right? So, that first phase of the board without any consultants involved, talking about, okay, what are our common components? Maybe what are a little bit unique about our common components? One of the things that I didn't mention previously, but we have a lot of experience around retaining walls design and evaluation. So, for example, if you have a lot of retaining walls at your community, looking for a consultant that specializes in retaining walls. If you know that you've got a lot of issues with roofs and you've had water intrusion issues, picking consultants with experience in those areas makes sense. So I think there's no one consultant that's right for every community, but really thinking about again, what issues are we concerned about? What historically have been our challenges, and what's unique about our community will help you pick the best fit for your community and your reserve study.
Once the reserve study is done, can the HOA board use that study, the results of that study, as their maintenance plan? I know that, in our case, we got a pretty comprehensive list of things that needed to be done, near term, long term, midterm, priority, high to low. Does that become a basis for the maintenance plan?
I certainly think it can be a tool that helps feed into your maintenance plan. I wouldn't say if you've got a reserve study done, that can become your maintenance plan. It can be used as a tool to inform, as well as your annual operating budget, as well as your list of projects that you've got that are approved and coming up. I think all of those different pieces of information can feed into that maintenance plan, but it obviously will require some thought in terms of what's coming up, and again, what projects do we foresee that need to be included in that maintenance plan. But it certainly doesn't. It doesn't serve both purposes of a reserve study and a maintenance plan.
Right. So, certainly a complement, but doesn't replace it, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Right. Well, thank you. We've been talking to Antony Startup. He's president of Criterium Twin Cities Engineers. A great perspective, Antony. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Mark.
HOA leaders can join the HOA Leadership Network for free. Go to our website and join. I'm Mark Foster on HOA Today. This is the HOA Leadership Network.